Create a call to action button with a reflection and shadow. A call to action is usually a button or sometimes a form which directs the user to make an action. So a button that says "Join now" is a call to action button. In order to create it, we'll start off with a basic shape. I generally recommend you stay away from the square buttons since they don't look as nice as the slightly rounded ones. So we'll select the rounded rectangle tool and set the radius to 5 pixels. Then we'll draw a decent sized button, pretty wide and tall enough that it can hold 2 lines of text. The next steps are very similar for when creating a main menu. We'll go to the FX panel and select a gradient. A predefined one is fine at this point. What I'm looking for is a nuance that will allow me to use white text with great legibility. Having the gradient set, we will set a stroke that's darker than the actual color. Sometimes you can go with the color at the very bottom of the gradient. Usually that works quite well. Then we'll add a bevel and emboss effect, and as usual, we'll only adjust these 2 settings. So, as you can see, nothing too complicated for the moment. Now let's add some text. We'll press T and click once. Something like "Get Started" is pretty common, so we'll go with that. Let's select a nicer font than Arial. Just scroll through and get a nice one. I usually recommend you use a font that has multiple weights. That means it has regular, bold, italic, etc. After you finish looking for a font, let's add a subtle drop shadow to increase its visibility. Now add a second line of text that is a short message like, "Sign up right now, get 50% off," or a message that will fit your button. As always, we can make the shape wider or taller by using the Control-A technique. The second line should usually have a different color than the first line, and it should always be smaller. We're going to need a good contrasting color, so something like yellow should do a good job. Make sure you decrease the size, and it's probably best to have a font set to normal since bold text isn't that legible. Drop shadows are generally not recommended for small text, but if you can make it look right, go for it. I will be sticking with the classic. To make sure your 2 lines of text are centered vertically in the button, you should group them and then use the tool up top. This way you won't have a different gap up top and another at the bottom. Remember how we made a separator from the main menu? We'll do the same here. But first, let's go get an arrow from the Custom Shapes panel. Its icon is this star. Then go up top and hit Shape, and a menu will appear. We're looking for a decent arrow or symbol of some sorts that represents action, movement, that kind of thing. Once you're happy with your selection, hold down Shift and drag. Make it white, and if needed, add a small drop shadow. This is a nice way to add some extra detail to your button. Now that we have that element in our button, let's arrange the text so it goes well with it and add a separator between them. So get the line tool, drag a line, and then use the Alt-Shift-Drag technique to duplicate, then make them black and the other white. Adjust the opacity, and there you have it. Just in case you want another option, you can make the arrow symbol darker than the button color, then go to the FX panel. Here we will select Inner Shadow, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It will add a shadow on the inside of the shape so it looks like it's pressed in the button. Size and distance should be fairly low in order to make it look good. 1 to 3 pixels is probably enough. So let's consider this our button, but we want to take it to yet another level. Well, of course, we can add a pattern to it, or maybe some subtle noise, but before we do that, though, we'll duplicate it by pressing Ctrl-J, just in case we mess up. It's always good to have a copy. Now hide one of the layers and continue working on the visible one. First step is to convert it to a smart object, and this is because certain effects completely mask others. For example, you can't have both color overlay and gradient, or a gradient and a pattern. You could play with the blending options, but that's not what I want to do right now. So right-click the layer and make it a smart object, and all the effects will be embedded in the layer and you can't change them anymore. What you can do, though, is add more. So let's go to the FX panel, select Pattern, and get one that will look good with a low opacity. The key here is subtlety. You don't want anything crazy that'll stand out too much. The best call to action buttons have fine details that make them stand out. Just in case you don't find anything that works or that you like, you can use the good old filter, noise, 1%, and boom, you're golden. Want even more for your button? Let's make it look like it's sitting on a floor. To do that, we could use a drop shadow, but I want something better. I will set black as my color and get the ellipse tool. Then I will drag a shape like this. The color should be black and the layer should go underneath your button, so make sure you move it into place. Now select both layers and center them. Then go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and press OK. The radius should be adjusted depending on the button. 5 to 7% is usually a pretty good bet. Now lower the opacity to make it less obvious, and if needed, reposition it. Another thing you can do is press Ctrl-T and flatten it a bit. You really have a lot of options here. You can make the buttons seem like it's floating by creating a darker, more intense shadow and having a bit of a gap between them. You can also have a very subtle shadow very close to the button. It depends on what you want to do in your design. What's important is you understand the principle and how it works. One final thing you could do is create a reflection of the button. To do that, group all the layers into a folder if you haven't done so already. The shadow can be left out. Now duplicate that group with Ctrl-J, press Ctrl-T, and hit Flip vertically. Now drag it underneath the button, both on the Layers panel and in the canvas. Now we'll use a button that sits next to the FX panel. That will add a layer mask, and what you need to know about it is how it works. Press it, and a thumbnail will appear in your Layers panel, and if you check the left side, you'll notice your colors have changed to black and white. To make it work, press G and select a gradient. Make sure it's linear from the top panel. It's the first icon. Now drag a bit and release. As you can see, it adds a nice fading effect to the button. Drag a few more times until you get the perfect reflection, and make sure you try different starting points and different lengths. One last thing you can do is to lower the opacity to make it more subtle. And there you have it, a good-looking call to action button with a reflection and a shadow in only a few minutes. Sometimes it might be better to only use a reflection without a shadow or vice versa, but what matters is you understand the principle and create a few of your own.